Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. So we're here now with Venerable Jaguru, and my name is Bhante Sudaso, and we'll be talking a bit about the topic of fear and dread with reference to the sutta from the Majjhima Nikaya of a similar name, the Bhayabherava Sutta, translated by Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi as the Discourse on Fear and Dread. So we can start by paying homage to the Buddha, and then we'll say some words on the topic. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So first, just to give a brief introduction to the discourse that this topic was drawn from. So in this particular discourse, it takes the form of a conversation between a Brahmin and the Buddha. So the Brahmin Janusoni, who later becomes a Buddhist, by the way, but at this time, he's not a Buddhist. He's just someone who's coming to ask questions of the Buddha. So he makes the observation that it's very difficult to practice in the forest, to practice in the wilderness. He makes the comment that the forest seems to harass the mind of someone who doesn't have good meditation. And the Buddha agrees. He agrees that, yes, this is true. It is difficult to live in seclusion in the wilderness. And it is quite challenging if one's meditation practice is not well developed. And then the Buddha tells a story of his own practice. And he's focusing particularly on fear. So he's mentioning how people who go to practice in the wilderness, if their conduct is not pure in various ways, or their mind is not pure in various ways, then that's the source of their fear. So he gives the example of someone who is not pure in their physical conduct, their verbal conduct, their mental conduct, or their livelihood. So in other words, somebody has some kind of distinct moral shortcomings. So perhaps they do things that hurt people, or they say hurtful words, or they have a job which is harmful to sentient beings, or they're constantly engaging in harmful thinking. Then those are things which create the conditions for fear to arise when one is practicing in seclusion in the wilderness. And he says, but he doesn't see any of these things in himself. So he was like, well, it would be, I don't have any reason to be afraid if I go to practice in the forest, because the Buddha was reflecting. So this is before the Buddha attained awakening, but he was reflecting that his own conduct was impeccable. His own virtue and morality was impeccable. And he goes on, if someone has the 5 hindrances, so sensual desire, aversion, dullness, agitation, or skepticism, then because of those 5 hindrances, any one of them, then if someone goes to try to meditate in the forest and live in seclusion, then they might have fear arising in them. And again, the Buddha says that, but in himself, he doesn't see this particular problem. So keeping in mind the Buddha at this time was not yet fully awakened. So this was before his awakening. But still, he saw that his own purity of mind was much higher than that for most people. He saw that his practice had already led to the 5 hindrances being mostly absent in him, which is, of course, one of the critical requisites for good meditation, is a mind that's free of these 5 hindrances: sensual desire, aversion, dullness, agitation, and skepticism. Then carrying on, he says, people who praise themselves and insult others, again, this is a basis for having fear arise when one is in the forest. Those who are timid cowardly, again, a basis for fear. Those who long for acquisition, respect, and fame. Those who are lazy. Those who have a lack of mindfulness and clear awareness. Those who have a scattered mind. Those who are foolish and oblivious. So these are all examples, he says, of if people have these conditions, then yes, they could have fear arising if they go to meditate alone in the wilderness. And in each case, the Buddha says, but this is not a description of himself. He says he doesn't have any of these conditions, so he doesn't have anything to fear about going into the forest alone. So then he makes the determination that a few times a month he would go and spend a day and night meditating alone in the wilderness and see if any fear comes up in him. So that's what he does. And again, he has the observation that when he's in the forest, then he would hear a sound or see something, and it would bring up fear in his mind. So even if it's just a deer moving through the underbrush or the wind rustling the leaves, then still fear would arise in his mind. So even though his mind is relatively pure, still fear is appearing in his mind. So he makes the resolution that he's not going to change his posture until he overcomes his fear. So if he's sitting, he will remain sitting until he overcomes the fear, removes it from his mind. If he's walking, he'll continue walking until he overcomes the fear, and so on. So not trying to escape the feeling of fear, not trying to distract himself from it, but actually focusing completely on the feeling of fear so that he can understand it and make his mind unaffected by it. And then at this point in the sutta, the Buddha then goes on to give a brief summary of his development of the three higher knowledges, which lead to complete awakening. But at that point, it's no longer on the topic of fear. So we'll leave the rest of the sutta aside for the time being. And so we can discuss the topic of fear as it's been presented here in this discourse. So maybe at this time we can invite Venerable Jagro if you'd like to say some words on the topic of fear, either in general or related to the sutta here.
Yeah. So there's a couple things that came to mind. Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So when I was going over the sutta, so one of the things that came to mind was, well, actually, I could hold the poly here, so I can ask the. Let's see. Oh, it is. It's side by side.
If you want side by side, you need to use somebody else's.
Oh,
translation.
let's do.
Yeah. So only with Bhante Sujantos do you get the side by side.
Okay. So. So there's a lot of kind of repetition for the sutta, like many suttas. Let's see here. Let me just go through one of them. Purified. So let's go. Okay. So I'm assuming this is Kusalam Bhayabherava.
Yeah.
Bhayabherava. Yeah. So there's a qualifier, the Kusalam Bhayabherava, and so that was actually one of the first thing that came to mind. So that he wasn't referring to kind of any fear and dread, but in particular as unskillful fear and dread. So that was actually one of the things that came up, and so that gave it kind of a curiosity, and I have some thoughts around that. I mean, one of the thoughts, of course, is that it's actually appropriate to actually have a certain amount of it's called hiriotapa, and it gets translated different ways. Sometimes it's like kind of like a fear or dread or shame around verbal or physical or mental misconduct. And so I think this is one of the things that's actually worth kind of keeping in mind, that it's the Buddhist practice isn't necessarily to just kind of any kind of fear that comes to our mind, it's immediately we need to kind of like stamp it out, destroy it, that kind of attitude. But it's more like, is the fear arising? Is this appropriate or is it not appropriate? Is this kusala or akusala fear? So he was in all the different iterations that he's always pointing that is this akusala fear and dread. That was the first thing. One of the things I was actually also curious about towards the end, he was like comparing himself with other Brahmins before he goes into talking about his awakening process. let's see. Oh, there are some ascetics at Brahmins who perceive that it's day when it's in fact night, or perceive that it's night when it's in fact day. This meditation of theirs is delusional, I say. I perceive that it's night when it's in fact night, and perceive that it's day when it's in fact day. And I was kind of thinking about that, and actually, I'm curious what your thoughts or anybody else's thoughts around this, and that if he was being quite literal with this, or if this was a metaphor for something. And I'm not sure, to be honest. I wouldn't know what the metaphor would be pointing to if it was a metaphor. So all I have is like maybe he was just speaking quite literally about this. So that's actually one of the questions I personally have around this particular sutta. I think that's those were the two things that came up. So.
Yeah, so well, actually, that point that you're making, so this section here where he talks about contemplatives who perceive day as night and night as day, I think his point there is he's talking about people who are generating a false reality in their mind, where he's saying, by contrast, he's saying, I, meaning the Buddha, I see night as night and I see day as day. So he's saying that he's seeing reality exactly as it is. So again, it's not like he's escaping into a dream world, but rather he's actually facing reality on its own terms and is not swayed by it, is not afraid of it.
Got it. So basically, your interpretation of that that's a metaphor for basically non-delusion. Like, okay, fear is arise. I'm not going to try to pretend like I'm going to go to escape in some fantasy land and pretend this isn't a kind of a dreadful, scary forest, but it's like Disneyland or something. Of course, there was no Disneyland back then, but kind of the equivalent of that. That makes sense to me.
Also, I appreciated your pointing out that he says akusala Bhayabherava, so unwholesome fear and dread, because also it comes to mind to me as like, what is the basis for the arising of fear? So, for example, he mentioned someone who has strong desires, sensual desire. Well, so then what does one have to be afraid of? Well, it's the fear of not getting the objects of your desire. So if you're full of craving for a particular kind of food and you go to live in a secluded place in the forest, well, you might not get that kind of food. And that would just be fearful and dreadful. Wouldn't that be awful? And of course, in monasteries, we normally live a very restrained and celibate life. So again, if one is fixated on pursuing sensual pleasure, there's a lot to be afraid of in a place like this. Actually, I remember somebody came here a while back who was really addicted to their phone. And so one of the rules we have here is that people are not supposed to keep their phones in their room and actually are not supposed to use their phones most of the time. And this person was absolutely disgusted and horrified. And at one point they said, I can't believe I came to this awful place just because there were restrictions on using their phone. So again, this is an example of this unwholesome fear and dread. So it's fear and dread connected to one's defilements. And again, if we go through like all the examples that the Buddha's giving, so things like praising oneself and disparaging others. So again, this is something unwholesome. So it's about trying to puff up one's ego and put down other people. Or he talked about, being full of aversion. So again, it's things which create the condition for fear of retribution. So fear of, for example, there's a number of suttas where the Buddha talks about when one is going to live in a place where there might be hostile spirits or hostile beings, then including snakes or whatever, then to bring up a mind of loving kindness. If we have a mind of loving kindness, then we're less likely to be attacked by hostile beings. Whereas if our mind is full of aversion and hostility and negativity, then that's making us a target for these beings. It takes away part of our safety. So it also can be a source of feeling afraid. It's fear based upon that unwholesome state of mind. Yeah, so that's one thing which I think is worth pointing out, that all of the examples the Buddha is giving as reasons to be afraid when going into the forest, they're all connected with defilements of some sort, some kind of unwholesome state of mind.
One other thing I forgot to mention was also that in the as he goes through the different things, the different things that he's reflecting on, the different unwholesome aspects of the mind. He mentioned there's a, how do you say this? He was reflecting on this, and then as a result of reflecting on this, he became more and more confident.
Mm-hmm.
And this is actually something that the Buddha and other suttas encourages us to do. In other words, to reflect actually on our own wholesome and skillful conduct. You know, for example, if you've, for example, kept your precepts today, like, you know, at the end of the day, actually spend some time before you go to sleep to reflect on, oh, I kept, let's say you're on the 5 precepts. Did I keep the first precept? I did. Did I keep the second precept? Oh yeah, I kept it. And actually, there was this situation today where, you know, I was thinking about, gosh, you know, like I was really wanted that thing that this, you know, my friend had. I was going to take it, or maybe more realistic. Maybe like often people, I think I've heard people like want to rationalize taking things from the office, for example, right? And so, you know, what it is like, okay, I was very mindful of it. I didn't take that pen from the office, even though, you know, everybody else does that. I didn't do it. And you go, oh yeah, you know, I restrained myself. I kept that precept. And you go to the 3rd precept, 4th precept, 5th precept. And so this is actually something that's encouraged to do. And so like, similarly, like, oh, it's like worth going through, you know, like this is like a list. I don't know how many, maybe, you know, 15 different things that one can go through. And there's probably things there that one actually is quite skillful at, you know, like that has an absence of this particular defilement of the mind. And that can actually help buoy the mind, give it some confidence. Like, okay, I'm not, you know, there's often I've heard many Buddhists say, I'm a complete basket case, you know, I don't know why I'm even trying this, you know, but you wouldn't be here if you truly were, you know, completely defiled in every single way. I'm pretty confident at least one of these things you can say, actually, you know, I think I have some, you know, skill at this. And so you too can go to a scary forest and have a little confidence there at least.
Yeah, actually, I really appreciate you mentioning that, because this is a really important quality. Is often we fixate on our shortcomings, but actually the focusing on what we're good at then helps us to give us the confidence to maintain and improve the good qualities we have, but also the confidence to increase the qualities which we're lacking in. It's recognizing that actually we are capable of training the mind. The mind is not intractable, but with time and effort and persistence and wisdom, we can transform the mind. And actually, that's kind of the whole principle of Buddhist practice. It's the idea that the mind is completely transmutable. So anything in the mind which is unwholesome or confused or blurry or harmful, any of that can be altered. It can be changed. And this is what makes awakening possible, is the fact that anything about the mind can be changed through deliberate training and development. Any other comments on the discourse, or should we maybe see if there's any questions or comments?
I'm ready for questions or comments.
Okay. Well, first off, hello to all the people joining in online. So hello to Janaki, Rick, Jay, Gita, Bhumika, Jake, Kumu, Jeff, Yankee, Lely, Andy, Julie, Kim, and Yudi. Welcome. And Joe, you have a question?
In terms of the wilderness, I think the main fear is being eaten alive by animals, and so I think there's metta, but there's also, that seems like a skillful. Doesn't seems like appropriate fear. You know, there are bears, and they're I can go into detail about, you know, some animals will, like a cat, will usually get you pretty quickly because it really wants you to up on the tree, so you'll probably not suffer too much. But other animals, like a grizzly bear, they're kind of brutal in the way that they hunt. And so just to have that knowledge going into the wilderness is like, that seems like spreading to the bear is like appropriate at that time, or we should have wise fear that there's that possibility of running into a hungry grizzly bear.
Well, first off, I would just point out that wild animals usually do not randomly attack humans, and even carnivorous predators, apparently humans don't taste good, so we're usually their absolute bottom of the menu. So, for example, the monastery where both of us were trained at, there's mountain lions, and I've seen them, and they were completely uninterested in me because I'm not the kind of food they like to eat. That monastery is full of deer, which is apparently delicious. So the fact that it's also full of humans is completely irrelevant to the mountain lions because we're not delicious. So if you look at statistics, rates of animals attacking humans is actually quite low. So I actually don't personally have that particular fear of wild animals. It's not a thing for me. And yes, having metta, but also having the wisdom to avoid them. So in the Sabbasava Sutta, the Buddha also says to avoid wild elephants and wild horses and wild dogs, so beings which might actually be physically dangerous to you. But we avoid them not out of fear, but rather out of a recognition that this body is a useful tool for Buddhist practice, and we want to keep this body in relatively good condition. And also recognizing that if we are getting attacked by something, then we might produce anger and hatred. So it's better not to put ourselves in that kind of situation if it can be avoided. So yeah, the Buddha did not seem to be a fan of deliberately seeking out life-threatening and dangerous situations. But he did talk about maintaining equanimity and peace of mind when faced with those kinds of situations. So sometimes you hear about like Buddhist monks in Thailand who would deliberately go to tiger-infested forests just in the hopes that they might be frightened by tigers. But this doesn't quite seem to be anything the Buddha actually recommended. So going to meditate in the forest because it's a secluded and peaceful place to meditate, yes. Going to meditate in a place where there's a very real chance of getting attacked and killed by wild animals, that's not the Buddha's instructions.
Great. Yeah, I read about that.
Do you have any thoughts on these?
I mean, it is worth mentioning there's a certain amount of risk in anything that we do. I mean, living in the city, there's actually a certain amount of risk, going to a more urban, a semi-urban environment, a suburban environment, there's a certain amount of risk. Going to a rural area, there's a certain amount of risk. Going to a forest, there's just different kinds of things, right? For me, like, for example, the thing that I'm most cognizant of when I step outside, there's not wild animals, they're cars. That's the thing that Metrico and I talk about this a lot. It's like what? No, it's the cars. That's what I'm most concerned about, and so wild cars instead of wild, elephants are the things that I'm always actually looking around. So they step around a corner, it's like broom, they come right by, and people aren't always paying attention, or they're on their cell phones or whatever. So does it mean that, should we, like, okay, I should leave the city because they're cars, right? I mean, you kind of see what I'm saying? But cars are a very serious risk, right? And so it's kind of keeping that in mind. Similarly, when I was living in a Bhayabherava, there are mountain lions there, and I remember there was one day that a deer was killed pretty close by to the cabin, or what's called kuti in Pali, where I was living. And I remember the night when I was walking by to go back to my cabin at night. And yeah, there was definitely a palpable sense of fear. I mean, before then there was all these like vultures around, kind of, getting getting, what they could of the carcass before the mountain lion would come back, and I noticed that none of the vultures were there, so it must, maybe the mountain lions around, and so there's definitely a palpable sense of fear, right? But it was worth mentioning, like nobody at Bhayabherava in its history there has been attacked by a mountain lion.
Mm-hmm.
So I was going by that basic principle, and for a lot of people the people there that were much more experts on mountain lions, they would say if a mountain lions can move in such a way, they'll never show themselves that they actually want to attack you, right? And I remember one monk saying that they actually showing themselves, it means they want you to see them. I thought that was interesting. But yeah, I mean, I was actually much more afraid of the ticks there, because they can carry Lyme's disease, than it was the mountain lions in general. So yeah, I think it's also about having to actually discern what's the appropriate danger here, if there is a danger.
And I think also similarly what the Buddha is pointing to in the sutta is he's pointing to the fact that fear is almost always based in some kind of unwholesome state of mind. So he goes through giving many examples of reasons why one might experience fear, and none of it actually has anything to do with a genuine external danger. It all has to do with some kind of defilement or delusion in one's own mind. So I think that's one of the main points of the suttas. The Buddha is pointing to the fact that fear is almost always based in defilement and delusion, rather than in anything external. And again, also this perception of the forest or the wilderness as being dangerous. Actually, I have the opposite perspective. Cities are dangerous. Forests are actually relatively safe. It's actually interesting when we were doing Tudong in Sicily last year. I remember people saying like, "Oh, aren't you scared that the gangsters are going to attack you in the forest?" And I was like, "Well, no. For one thing, you're much more likely to get attacked by gangsters in like the inner cities of Rome or Milan than you are anywhere in Sicily. Also, they don't just attack random people, and especially like penniless wandering renunciants. Like if you're trying to rob someone, we're the absolute worst people to rob. It's like, well, what are you gonna take? Like, you want my glasses? I mean, it's probably the most valuable thing I have. They're probably not the right prescription for you, but you can have them if you want. But it was that reflection, like there's this idea, people have this idea of like wandering in the wilderness in Sicily is somehow like definitely you're going to get attacked by gangsters. But actually you're much more likely to get attacked by criminals just walking down the streets of Rome or New York City or Toronto or something. But we do that without any fear or trepidation. So again, the Buddha is pointing to the fact that a lot of this is coming from our perceptions and thoughts. So the fear is not necessarily coming from anything real outside ourselves, but it's coming from our perceptions and thoughts.
Can I clarify something about it?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think what's coming up to mind is that a lot of us in this modern day are very safe because of society, right? Relatively, and we just don't know. Like, I think the fear is the fear of the unknown, the fear of not knowing, like not recognizing not understanding what intense fear feels like and how to handle it when it arises. So like we're always kind of feel vulnerable or left, unprepared if we don't go get like military training or become monks. It's like, how do we prepare ourselves for intense moments of fear?
So I actually don't recommend military training just because, you see what happens. I mean, you can be very liable to start engaging with a lot of unwholesome actions, namely killing people. But even if that doesn't happen, I don't see sort of an absence of fear out of sort of the results that can come out of that. I mean, it might happen, but that's I kind of understand what you're saying, but it's like I feel it's kind of like there was a previous conversation we're having about, kind of the future, right? And I would encourage you maybe just to practice with simple things, right? Things that you don't have to like imagine some sort of like encounter with a grizzly bear, right? Like, and this, you're like all preparing for this, this life and death encounter with a grizzly bear. Just it's like, oh, like just practice with the things that life presents you, because if there's actually a tendency towards fear and aversion, it's going to present itself with ordinary things your life is presenting to you, because if the mind's habituated that way, it will start to come up. And so again, like I think mindfulness of the body is really useful, because the body will tell you what's going on, right? When you get a sort of you start to become sensitive to the body, fear has a very kind of distinctive signature you'll start to notice. And then you get to start to see, it's like, oh, okay, this is the experience of fear. You get this, oh, is this pleasant? This is unpleasant? Is it neutral? Is it some kind of combination? What are the conditions in which it arises? What are the conditions in which it subsides, right? You get to become much more familiar with, and you start becoming less and less reactive to it. So again, the grizzly bear thing, it's a nice movie thing, but I think what's actually going to practically help, even if a grizzly bear does attack in the future, is actually practicing with the ordinary things that are happening every day.
Yeah, and also in terms of things which present mortal danger. So it's also recognizing that as long as we keep cultivating wholesome mind states, then we will keep progressing towards awakening in this life and in future lives. So we don't have anything to worry about. And also, as long as we keep cultivating wholesome mind states, then even if we're faced with very challenging situations, then we'll be able to deal with it in a relatively skillful and appropriate way. And we have a number of questions online, so I'd like to take some of these questions from online. Mm-hmm. So Jeff asks, are there different types of fear that arise from the different causes mentioned? Or does he mean that the result is a basic fear? So he doesn't go into that level of detail in this discourse, but I would say that there are many different shades and varieties of fear. And a lot of the emotional vocabulary that we use in English is actually quite imprecise, quite general and vague. So the word fear can actually refer to dozens of distinctly different varieties of emotion, which we all kind of generally lump under the one word fear. We don't necessarily have a refined enough vocabulary to distinguish these different distinct experiences. But as you pay close attention to your own mind, you can pick apart these distinctions. Even though you may not have the words for these distinctions, you can still observe them. Just like someone who maybe doesn't have a big color vocabulary, they might see two things and call both of them blue. But somebody else might be like, well, actually, that's aquamarine and that's teal. And I'm like, it's blue and it's blue. It's kind of just blue. But somebody else can be like, okay, this is these. Each one has its own distinct specification. So it's the same with emotions. We use a word like fear, but that can refer to several slightly different shades of emotion, which we all put under the same word. Thoughts?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Okay. Gayatri says, I was wondering if the fear here talked about is different from anxiety. What are your thoughts?
I think that, yeah, it's very similar to the previous question. Yeah, I think fear and anxiety are they overlap a lot. I mean, a lot of times these words anyways, I mean, when you say fear to one person and their actual experience of fear may be slightly different than the other person's tangible experience of fear. But yeah, I think they're in the same constellation.
Mm-hmm. And Kim says, similarly, Kim says, I've heard that anxiety is worrying about the future. How do you stop the mind spin? Well, actually, we were talking about that a bit this morning. So what is the future? The future is a daydream. It's an illusion in your mind. The future doesn't exist. So how can you worry about something which doesn't exist? So maybe you spend all your time worrying and concerned and planning about what to do when your aunt comes to visit tomorrow, but then she cancels. And then what was all that worrying good for? Nothing whatsoever. Or maybe you're worried because when she comes, she always talks about boring things, or she always speaks rudely, and so you're all worried about that. And then she shows up, and instead it's a really interesting and pleasant conversation. So what was all that worrying good for? What good did any of that worrying do you? So it's good to reflect that we really have no idea what's going to happen in the future. And so the best way to prepare for the future is not worrying about different possible scenarios, but rather cultivating the skill sets which allow us to face any situation with confidence and serenity. And that skill set is, in fact, the 7 factors of awakening, the 4 Brahma Viharas, the 5 spiritual powers, and so on. So the practices that we do in Buddhism, these mental qualities that we develop in Buddhism. So you don't need to worry about the future. You just need to cultivate the Bodhipatya Dhammas, the 37 practices which are conducive to awakening. And then whatever happens in the future, you'll be able to deal with it appropriately. Anything?
Oh, that's great.
Okay. And Janaki says, in ancient times, we've heard that there had been cannibalism in certain parts of the world. Could that have happened due to fear? I think more likely delusion. I've actually read about some of the tribes that used to do cannibalism in various parts of the world. And actually, most of it was based upon religious beliefs, such as a belief that by eating someone's body that you would inherit their strength or their wisdom or their intelligence or their agility or something about them that was good. So there were tribes which they would eat like the wise members of their own tribe when they passed away, believing that this was a way to keep that wisdom in the tribe. Or they would eat their enemies. Like if you defeated a strong enemy, you would eat them so that you would absorb their strength. So these are all examples of action based upon delusion. So a wrong view or a wrong belief about the world. It's hard for me to think how fear could be a basis for cannibalism.
Yeah, I can definitely see greed. You know, if somebody tastes good, you're like, hey, yeah, right.
Well,
yeah.
I've never personally eaten humans, but actually I've heard it's not that tasty.
Okay. I mean, I haven't, I don't know, but you know, people have developed taste for all sorts of interests, you know, things that I don't like. So I can see it, you know. I'm not suggesting people do this. I'm just saying, you know, like people do some weird stuff, you know.
Okay, we have a lot of questions online. Let's take some more. Cameron says, I'm still having a hard time with having metta for ticks meditating in the forest. Lyme disease is no joke. Any tips?
Yeah, I mean, I would maybe, you know, kind of think about this in a more general sense. You know, there's going to be always something that presents itself as like, very frightening, or like in a sense of like, you know, you have a hard time. They're not coming across as like a cuddly kind of creature, you know, like, you know, cats. We have a Teddy here, and you know, Teddy has a kind of cuddly sense, but he also has like quite a, you know, he's a cat, so he has a vicious sense. You can imagine if you're a mouse or a bird, it'd be quite terrifying, right? But for us humans, he's quite cuddly, and so yeah, maybe, you know, maybe that can be a way of kind of thinking about like how can you see the tick as cuddly, right? As a kind of a creature that's has a sense of kind of vulnerability, a sense of innocence to it, right? I mean, ticks, I seriously doubt that ticks have anything against you. In fact, of course, you know, Lyme disease is just something that they just go to, you know, it's just like all the spirochetes or whatever that's components of Lyme disease. That's just something they're just kind of ingesting. They're not even aware it's there. They have no idea who you are. They're just, just trying to scrape out some sort of existence before they die. It's pretty, if you think about it from a tick's perspective, it's a pretty kind of, it's just like, oh, please give me some food. I'm so cold. I'm so hungry. And, oh, I don't know. I'm just, but, just kind of play with it. Because really, I mean, if you think about it, it takes existence. It's pretty desperate. It's pretty hunger oriented. And then they die. And most of them probably die before they even, get any sort of nourishment and before they become adult ticks. So, yeah, try to see it. Maybe try to see ticks from a different angle. That's what comes to mind.
Yeah, good. And Yudi says, I think people fear animals because they don't understand them. Animals won't attack humans unless they feel threatened or provoked. In fact, they prefer avoiding humans because we are their predators. Yeah, that's true. Generally, animals won't attack unless they feel threatened. Usually, if you just keep a safe distance from them, they'll leave you alone. In fact, they'll usually run away from you. Usually avoid us. And Sud asks, how would Buddhanusati remove fear? I read this in a sutta where the Buddha says, look for my flag, etc. How is this helpful in removing fear and dread? I assume you're referring to the Dajaga Sutta. The translated as crest of the banner, or along those lines. Well, because when we recollect the Buddha, I mean, for what that does for me is it reminds me that, one, awakening is possible. Two, we have the teachings of an awakened being. So to me, recollection of the Buddha naturally leads in the direction of recollection of the Dhamma. So awakening is possible. And in fact, somebody did it quite recently, and in fact taught many other people how to attain awakening as well. We have access to those teachings. We have the ability to understand them and to cultivate them. In my case, I've been practicing for most of my life. So working on developing these qualities which lead to awakening. Also, we have the Sangha. So either the opportunity to spend time with the Sangha or to join the Sangha for periods of time, or possibly for a lifetime or more. So these are things which, again, lead towards awakening. So then it kind of makes everything else in life seem relatively small. It's like, yeah, it's true. I might get killed by a wild car tomorrow, or I might die in my sleep tonight, or I might get killed by a wild boar next time I'm on Tudong. This is all quite possible. I might be the subject of slander or malicious gossip. I might, any number of things might happen to me, but that doesn't matter because I have the Dhamma and I have the path to awakening, and I've been cultivating these wholesome qualities which will carry with me even into future lives. So the minor unpleasant things which can happen to us are not so important because they cannot take away our wholesome states of mind. That's actually one of the central points of the Kakachupama Sutta, the simile of the saw. The Buddha is pointing out how even when we're in a very dangerous and unpleasant situation, namely being dismembered by bandits with saws, then even in that situation, we can still maintain our purity of mind. So our purity of mind is not determined by our external conditions. It's determined by our own activities of mind, our own decisions of mind. So for me, that's how Buddhanusati is a way of cleansing the mind from fear. Yeah, any thoughts? Okay. Okay, so Julie says, I have been hearing extremely subtle sounds in silent environments while doing sitting meditation. I never heard these sounds before meditating since they are so subtle and faint. I fear that I might lose grip on reality. Like, is this real or imagined? Fear of the unknown. How do I reassure myself I am still healthy and not losing it? By the way, I don't have a history of mental illness.
Doesn't sound like you're losing it. I mean, yeah, if you meditate, and especially if you actually use sound as a basis of meditation, you'll start to hear very subtle sounds. There's actually a particular kind of sound that people actively try to listen for. I think Ajahn Sumedho spent a lot of time with this. There's a book on this that he wrote, or at least was transcribed from talks, called, I think, The Sound of Silence or something like that. Doesn't sound abnormal at all.
Yeah, again, it's actually relatively common to start to notice sensory perceptions, which are normally too subtle to notice. And if you're worried about losing your grip on reality, then just keep coming back to mindfulness of the body. As long as you're thoroughly grounded in this real, tangible, physical presence of the body, then you're unlikely to get to lose your grip.
You know, I was thinking, usually when I feel like I'm losing grip on reality, it's when I'm talking with other people. I'm just like, I'm like, oh man, it's like, what's going on? Am I like misunderstanding? What's going on? So it's like, mindfulness of the body is always good.
Yeah. And John says, do you think Americans should be concerned with China and Russia coming together as military allies? So for as long as there's been humans, there's always some group of people fighting another group of people, and these people allying with those people to fight these other people, and it never stops. It's been going on since forever, and it will continue forever. So this is just the latest details in an endless story of fill in the blank. So fill in the blank is at war with fill in the blank and is allying with fill in the blank against fill in the blank. It's just, you can take exactly that sentence and put it at literally any era of human history, and it's a true sentence. Only the names change. The story doesn't change. It's the same old story over and over and over and over and over again. So no, don't be concerned. International politics is always a disaster. So if you're involved in international politics, then you get the monumental task of trying to make it better. If you're not involved in international politics, which is most people, then your concern is instead, how can I make the world better within my domain of influence? And for most people, their domain of influence is quite small, usually about 100 people or so. So can you make life better for the people in your immediate domain of influence? That should be your focus. Not about war between the US and China or like Russia. Like, let's be realistic, you can't do anything about that. What you can do is you can be nice to your friends and nice to your neighbors and nice to everyone that you meet, and you can try to influence the people around you to be more decent human beings. That's what you can do.
If I can add one other thing. Another thing you can do, I'm sure you know this by this point, but in case you don't, there are a lot of people getting paid lots of money, and some people doing it for free to try to influence you and me to think all sorts of things, including getting fear of one group or another, or one country or another. So it behooves you to hear something or read something. Maybe you don't hear or read it. Maybe somebody is trying to encourage you to have fear about something. So just putting that out there.
And
that also has been going on for a long time.
Yeah. So Cameron says, a big fear is always needing to buy more time, resources for adequate training and attainment. Dying sooner means less time to practice effectively and meaningfully. Thoughts? So dying sooner does not mean less time to practice effectively and meaningfully. That is wrong view based upon the belief in YOLO. You don't live only once, you live an infinite number of times. So this is actually one of the reassuring things about the Buddhist doctrines of karma and rebirth. If you don't attain awakening in this life, that's okay, because you get another try and you don't start over at zero, because you actually carry through whatever qualities you developed in this life. So if you spend a lot of time developing concentration, for example, in this life, then in your next life, your skill at concentration will already be substantially higher than baseline. You don't need to worry about that. So yeah, okay. So you have a limited amount of time in this life, make the most of it. That's true. But also, don't freak out about the possibility of an early death. It's not the end of the story. It can be a little bit disorienting. In fact, apparently it's usually quite disorienting, that whole dying and being reborn thing. But you don't lose the progress you've made. And I don't quite know what you mean by buy more time and resources. But maybe that's because I'm a monk and I never think in terms of buying things.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what Cameron is meaning either. So yeah, just keep practicing. Yeah.
Okay, Rick says, can you speak to similar anxieties / fear feelings that are created by trauma that we experienced earlier in this life or in past lives, which is a reaction to what has already happened?
Yeah, actually, I was actually thinking about this. I was hoping somebody would ask a question on trauma. I'm not a psychologist or a therapist or a psychiatrist, or I'm just a not so simple. Not so simple Buddhist monk. trying to live more simply. But around, so it is worth mentioning, like the Buddhist prescription here, where he talked about how he trained himself around when he was in the forest. Around there was fear presenting itself, and when he was sitting, he would just stay seated. If he was walking, he would just keep walking. If he was standing, he would keep standing. And if he was lying down, he'd stay lying down, as a way of overcoming that fear and dread. It is worth mentioning, though, that sometimes, especially people, if we have a very acute experience in the past, that's often gets characterized as a traumatic experience. And one of the things about this is we have like a very strong all these things are involuntary, but a very strong response to this that tends to amplify, right? It does, like typical methods that we do to try to resolve that experience can exacerbate it. So instead of that fear subsiding over time, it actually can either stay the same or even compound and get worse. And so it's worth mentioning that if you do have such like a strong reaction to something, strong fear reaction to some particular stimuli or some particular situation, is to be cognizant of that, right? You're going to have to practice maybe differently, or than maybe methods that you've tried before. Getting, seeking advice from others is actually really important. People that there's a lot of people that fortunately study this. So, and I think there's probably a lot of books and other things out there on the subject. But it's worth keeping in mind that there are certain situations or certain people that have experienced certain situations that were particularly acute, that maybe a particular practice may not help with, or even might exacerbate that traumatic kind of response. And so it's worth keeping in mind, is this practice I'm doing actually leading to that fear subsiding slowly over time, or is it actually making it worse? And basically keeping a very close eye on that. So
yeah, I would also just add to that to remember that Buddhist meditation is not meant to be a substitute for psychotherapy. So often people, realistically, if they're having issues with trauma, often realistically, you should just go and see a counselor and talk with them about what's going on. Bhante Sujato put this very eloquently, as he said, Buddhism begins where psychology ends. So again, not to overlook the value of conventional psychotherapy in dealing with certain issues such as strong trauma. That said, I mean, I do also just have to say that often I've talked to a number of people about trauma, and often when they start talking about what their trauma is actually based on, I'm kind of like, that's it? Like, really? That's it? And then I speak to people who've actually had incredibly traumatic things. Like just the other day, I was talking to a person who was living on an island when there was a tsunami and it killed literally 80% of her friends. And she's actually a really calm, happy, friendly, delightful person. So she actually went through something that in theory is an extremely traumatic incident, but she came out of it pretty much unscarred. And other people, it's like, oh, when I was 12, somebody said something rude to me and I'm scarred for life. And it's like, oh, come on, seriously, don't make such a big deal out of these things. So we also do need to be somewhat realistic about how we can compound stories in our mind. So this is one thing the Buddha was talking to about the process of papancha, mental proliferation. We can take a story and just keep telling it to ourselves over and over again and keep building up the story and building up the story and making it into something incredibly massive and complex and overbearing and overwhelming. And it's all just a construct in our mind. And that's not necessary. But dismantling that construct is not always something that we can easily do on our own, which again is why I was saying it's important not to overlook the usefulness of conventional psychotherapy if somebody is having a lot of trouble with past trauma of some sort.
I would just add, like, it also is worth mentioning that sometimes like an example you gave is like that rude thing that happened. It was 12, and yeah, on the outside, it may be like, gosh, is that it? But you don't. It's also worth mentioning that person, for whatever reason, may have inadvertently compounded that situation, and then, by the time they're 20 or 25 or 30 years old, they're actually suffering a lot from it. It doesn't. It's worth mentioning. That doesn't mean you're not suffering a lot. It doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of pain and difficulty going on in your life. It just he's pointing out that we don't have to actually experience the world that way. It is possible. There's a possibility, even under extreme duress, to have a different alternative. And I think I would also just add, I know this is common in our older generations. It's I think thankfully it's something that people talk about more openly now. I think that's a good thing. But I know in the previous generations, many people, it was generally viewed that you didn't talk about such things, like you would be considered very inappropriate. You'd be considered weak if you had any sort of fear or thought about things in the past, and so I think there's actually there's something maybe positive about the modern culture of sharing these things more openly, because pretending, kind of like the discussion before, pretending that night is day and day is night. If this is what's going on in your mind, if you have this reoccurring thing that this person said something rude to you when it was 12 and it's very extraordinarily painful, that's reality. It's really important to reckon that's the reality that's going on, and not what the word I'm looking for. That's just what's going on.
Anyways, and we have some more questions here. So Manal says, at times I focus on how best to prepare my family if, let's say, I pass. How can I alleviate some of the overwhelm and anxiety of teaching my kids about the nature of death and grief? What's the anxiety? What's overwhelming? So you just teach them about death and grief. That's actually a good thing to do. And actually telling them that, you are in fact going to die someday. That sounds like a good thing to do. I don't actually see what the problem here is. Yeah.
Maybe it's this concern about not wanting to overwhelm the children, or.
Well, having never had children, I don't actually know how that works.
Yeah, I would say, as a parent, again, not having been a parent either, the children are going to pick up on your emotional state. So if you come in at the conversation with a balanced, peaceful, happy mind, they're going to pick up on that, right? And if you come into the conversation agitated and worried and very tense, they're going to pick up on that. So yeah, keep that in mind with whatever conversation you're talk about with your kids.
And Anthony says, how do you interpret the Buddha saying that he still meditates out of compassion for future generations, in addition to abiding blissfully? Is it because he's setting an example for others? I think part of it is, in fact, setting an example. But there's also the commentaries here express an opinion which may or may not be true, but it's worth considering. The commentary has the view that the Buddha spent much of his time doing karuna meditation, so compassion meditation, and in particular, reflecting on how he could help other people attain awakening. So this view seems to be that much of the Buddha's time in meditation was spent exploring how to help other people understand the Dhamma. So more of an active contemplation on teaching Dhamma rather than necessarily just doing mindfulness of breathing all the time, for example. Now, that comes from the commentary, so it may or may not be true, but it's quite plausible. But yeah, setting an example for others, yes. Also creating the necessary conditions in his own mind in order to clearly see how he can help other people. I suspect that was a part of what he was doing. But this is all supposition. It doesn't actually specifically say in the suttas. Maybe if there's some other questions, Linda, you had a question?
I did, and it's a bit nebulous, so any comment, or if it doesn't make sense, but at the beginning of the sutta, the Brahmin is asking the Buddha, do people like follow your lead, basically, in different words? And he's like, well, yes. And so that seems to me like, and then he talks about the forest. So it seems to me like he's asking, like, why do you do this? And so then at the end of the sutta, it says, I see two benefits that I still resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest. I see pleasant abiding for myself here and now, and I have compassion for future generations. So my question, as best as I can formulate it, is just trying to understand if there's something he is saying about fear itself, whether it's, for example, like his purpose is having people work on like the root causes of fear. Like it feels like it's by design that he's in the forest for compassion. I'm just trying to like, is there a meaning or not for kind of the frame of the sutta and how he ends it, and whether it's the role of fear or the purpose of what he's doing?
Well, I think the point about how he says others follow my example, and that's one of the reasons why he continues to meditate in the forest. I think that's because, as you were pointing to, the Buddha generally believes that meditating in the wilderness is a good thing for people, and that by continuing to do so himself, that inspires other people to take it seriously. So it might be a little bit disappointing, like if the Buddha had attained awakening, and then like he spent the rest of his life living in like a gold-plated mansion with like 100 nymphs and like drinking wine all day long. It's kind of like, wait, that's awakening? I'll pass. That actually doesn't look that appealing. But instead, the Buddha attained awakening, and he continued to live an extremely simple and austere life, and being completely happy with having nothing. And being completely happy just doing something like sitting quietly under a tree in the wilderness. So to me, that's very inspiring, because it's pointing to the nature of unconditional happiness, which is one of the central characteristics of awakening. So I think that's part of why the Buddha continued to live the way he did. It's not that he needed to, but rather it's that it was a clear demonstration to other people that unconditional happiness is possible, and that following Buddhist practice is a way of achieving that. Yeah, and yeah, go ahead.
One quick thing on grief in children. One of the best ways to teach children about grief is through pets.
Mm-hmm.
And the opportunity to see the pets come and go, and then perhaps equate that with the same thing that happens in humanity.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, the previous cat we had here died during the night sleeping next to me. And that was a incredibly powerful experience. So watching him go through the dying process over the course of a couple days and then finally passing away next to me. It was very, very powerful experience. Yeah. And did you have a question earlier?
Actually, it was Suit S.
Okay.
Obviously.
And Richard says, sometimes when the painful symptoms from my ongoing illness become overwhelming, I notice the storytelling ego kicks in on cue with its doomsday predictions, self-doubt, and dread. How can I set up a detour in place before as it arises in order to divert it into another realm? I don't really understand.
I think he's just using kind of poetic terms for how can I get rid of this, is I think what he's trying to say. That's kind of
get rid of what?
The doomsday predictions. He's starting to think a lot.
Doomsday predictions.
So sometimes when painful symptoms from my ongoing illness start to overwhelm, and then he noticed that there's a story that starts to come up, and then.
Was this the whole China and Russia story? Was this the same person?
Could have been, but I think this is a different question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, whatever.
Yeah. So he's just asking there's painful experiences he's having, and then his mind starts going into, I'm just going to make something up, I have this sickness. I actually, when I came here about a month and a half ago, I had the sickness, and let's say my mind started going, oh man, what if this is what if this is COVID, and what if this is going to be long COVID, and then I'm going to be bedridden, and then if I'm bedridden, I'm not going to be able to practice very much, and if I can't practice very much, I'm not going to be enlightened. And if I can't be enlightened, I'm going to go to hell forever, and I'm going to be in hell forever. And then, I'm trying to do this story, but so maybe one method what I just did is just try to outdo it. Try to out doomsday your doomsday story, and but he knows everybody here laughed, right? It is kind of, we were trying to be able to look at these habitual phenomena that are going on in our experience, in our minds, and trying to become a little more savvy to it, be a little more experienced, develop wisdom around it, and develop a sense of stability, so we don't get rocked by this sort of stuff when it starts to come up.
Also, you might try, rather than telling yourself the story of the horrible future that awaits you as you descend gradually through an ever worsening sickness and then die confused and get reborn in hell. Maybe instead you could tell yourself the story of your path to awakening. This life, I'm going to cultivate a lot of patience, a lot of equanimity. I'm going to cultivate at least intellectual wisdom and hopefully some experiential wisdom as well. I'm going to develop the Brahma Viharas, and I'm then going to die painfully from a horrible disease and be reborn in pleasant conditions where all these wonderful qualities I've been developing will propel me towards awakening. So if you like to tell yourself horrible stories, why don't you just switch around the stories to be something a bit more uplifting? And Anonymous says, in the past, if I woke up in the middle of the night and couldn't go back to sleep, I would feel horrible the next day. Now I don't need much sleep, but I'm still fearful I'm going to feel horrible. How can I change that thought process? Actually, again, just reflect on the fact that you no longer feel horrible if you don't get enough sleep. So pay attention to your actual felt experience. Remind yourself of your actual experience. Remind yourself actually the other day I only slept a few hours, but I still felt fine. The other day I woke up in the middle of the night, but I still got up early for meditation and I felt fine. So remind yourself that the story you have is not up to date anymore, that your actual experience these days is different. And if you keep reminding yourself that your actual experience doesn't match the old story, then the old story will eventually fade away from your mind.
One practice I've been using is whenever there's fear, anxiety, or something even more acute comes up, consciously, you bring up the actual okay, this is what the mind right now, the kind of that fearful part of the mind, this is what it's predicting. And then after that experience happens, remember, make a conscious, effort before this happens. So you're going to try to reflect on it and reflect. Okay, how accurate was this prediction? Right? So maybe you'll find out, okay, that was, when you first start, okay, that was 0 for 1, and 0 for 2, 0 for 3. Oh, and then maybe it got like half point, like on one occasion, right? So you get half out of 4. But you kind of keep doing this, and you'll start to notice that it doesn't necessarily won't necessarily work that way. It's going to work this way for different people. But if you have a tendency towards anxiety or fear, you'll actually find that it actually is not that great a predictor.
Yeah. Okay. And Joe, you have a question?
Yeah, my question is if we can examine what exactly is fear. What comes to mind is I remember seeing an emotional chart where the opposite of fear on the graph was trust. And that reminded me of the recollection of the Buddha, that almost that's like the height of trust. He's fully enlightened, and when we're contemplating a being, or for lack of a better word, who is completely harmless, is completely dedicated to our well-being. And so to contemplate the Buddha would give us a sense of safety because it would be the absence of fear, like almost like metta is the absence of ill will, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. And also the other thing is fear of what? So fear is almost always fear of some imagined future. So then one practice which is really helpful is silanusati, recollecting your own goodness, your own acts of kindness and generosity, recollecting all the good qualities you've been developing. And it's like, actually, I have the conditions for a really good future. So I haven't been making the bad karma that would lead to a really bad future. In fact, I've been making a lot of really good karma that leads to a really good future. So I can trust in my own goodness as being the driving force for my future experiences. So there's nothing to fear in the future because I've been making so many good conditions. And anything else before we wrap up for the evening? Yeah.
One thing from Joseph Goldstein's series on mindfulness that I just have to remind myself every now and then is, don't believe everything you think.
Yeah. Yeah, Ajahn Chah made a similar comment. Ajahn Chah said, point your finger right at your mind and say, liar. Yeah. Yep. Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and conclude at this time with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.